Chris started watching it. I saw one episode. He was Bernie
Hello everyone, could you hear me? We're going to start. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the Executive Director of the Ridgefield Historical Society. On behalf of everyone at the Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you to this very special presentation by Jack Kelly on his new book, God, Save Benedict Arnold, The True Story of America's Most Hated Man, which was released nationwide yesterday. I'd like to thank our friends here at St. Stephen's Church for providing this beautiful space for tonight's gathering, and thank you to Books on the Common, our beloved bookshop here in Ridgefield, for providing the books that Jack will be signing for you after the presentation today. The Ridgefield Historical Society is an independent, nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and sharing the entire history of Ridgefield, from the indigenous people who lived here 10,000 years ago to the present day. We invite all of you to get involved by becoming volunteers, members, and donors. Our headquarters is in the 1714 Scott House on Sunset Lane, and you can learn more by visiting ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org. We have many exciting projects underway at the Historical Society, and I'd like to briefly mention two of those related to the topic of tonight's presentation. In August, U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal joined us to announce the start of Phase 2 of our Battle of Ridgefield archaeology project, supported by a generous grant from the National Park Service to research and preserve the history of the battle through archaeological investigations in Ridgefield. If you own property in town that you'd like to consider for this study, please contact me. We're also spearheading the forensic studies at laboratories across the country of the Revolutionary War era skeletal remains found in a mass grave on Main Street, including cutting-edge genetic genealogy to identify and honor them. A couple weeks ago, bone samples were sent to the Armed Forces Medical Examiners System in Washington, D.C., and they will be conducting the initial testing for the viability of the DNA. Please join our email list to receive the latest updates on these exciting projects. On to tonight's presentation. Save Benedict Arnold, and the average person would say traitor, but students of Ridgefield history, while acknowledging his later treachery, would also call him a hero of the 1777 Battle of Ridgefield, where he rallied the Continental troops and local militias against a huge British force. While General Arnold, General David Worcester, and General Gold Selleck Silliman and their men couldn't defeat General Tryon's troops, they did demonstrate that invasions like the raid on Danbury were not without cost to the invaders. So esteemed was General Arnold here, he fought bravely at the barricade, and his horse was shot out from under him, and he suffered a leg injury, that for the 200th anniversary of the battle, the town of Ridgefield commissioned a medal honoring him, and it was reissued in 2002 for the 225th anniversary. Our special guest this evening is Jack Kelly. He is an award-winning author and historian. The New York Times called his writing adrenaline in words, and the Wall Street Journal said his book Valcour, quote, delivers an atmospheric blow-by-blow account in lean, readable prose. His latest book, God Save Benedict Arnold, The True Story of America's Most Hated Man, Kirkus Reviews described that book as, quote, a dazzling addition to the history of the American Revolution. Jack has received the DAR Medal and is a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow in Nonfiction Literature. He has written for many national publications and has appeared on the History Channel, National Public Radio, and C-SPAN. He lives and works in New York's Hudson's Valley. Please join me in welcoming Jack to Ridgefield.
Thank you very much. much, Stephen. I want to thank the Ridgefield Historical Society, and from what Stephen said, you can see they're doing very valuable work at keeping history alive. And thank you all for coming. I wanted to start out by taking a little poll and maybe a show of hands. Everyone who has never heard of Benedict Arnold could raise their hand. I guess there's a select group here. But the point is, Benedict Arnold has more name recognition than any other soldier who fought in the Revolutionary War, other than George Washington himself. And everybody that knows Benedict Arnold knows one thing about him. I'm not going to say what that is because you know what it is. But I wrote the book, and in my talks I'm trying to get across the idea that there was much more to Benedict Arnold than that one thing, and that it's important to understand Arnold in order to get a clear picture of the Revolutionary War. So I'm going to cite some examples of his achievements tonight from the book. My book is not a biography of Arnold. It's more of a manifesto or making the case for Benedict Arnold. And I sometimes think of it as Benedict Arnold's greatest hits. The Revolutionary War began on the morning of April 19, 1775, when the British Redcoats shot and killed 8 Minutemen at Lexington Green, and the Patriots came back and killed more than 70 of the King's soldiers, and the war was on. 3 weeks later, on May 10th, Benedict Arnold captured the most strategic fortification in the 13 colonies at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain in Upper New York. And he not only captured the fort, but he then went on his own initiative, without orders, up into Canada and captured a sloop of war that was the only British warship on Lake Champlain, and thereby secured the whole lake for the Patriots and protected Ticonderoga from being retaken. The question is, was that a significant achievement? I think it was, because the British strategy during the first 2 years of the war was to capture that water corridor that comes down from Montreal along Lake Champlain, Lake George, connects to the Hudson River, and all the way down to New York. That was the superhighway of that day. There was the roads were bad everywhere, and so a lot of the movement was by water, and that was a water route from Canada into the colonies. And the British thought that by capturing and controlling that corridor, they could split the colonies, isolate New England, and win the war. In addition to that, the cannon that they had found in Ticonderoga and confiscated the following winter were dragged across the entire state of Massachusetts on sleds and gave George Washington his first victory by driving the British out of Boston in March of 1776. So it seems like the capture of Ticonderoga was a very significant event. And when we look at the history books, it's barely a footnote. It's not given much importance. And often the credit is given to Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys were involved and provided the manpower. But the idea for taking over Ticonderoga was Benedict Arnold. The leadership was Benedict Arnold. And most importantly, the initiative to take over the lake was all Benedict Arnold. So the question then becomes, do we owe it to Benedict Arnold to get the history right? I don't think we do, because Benedict Arnold was a traitor. And there's nothing in my book that exonerates him or diminishes his treason. And I think in many ways his treason was worse than most people imagine. But we don't owe it to him, but we owe it to ourselves to iron out the discrepancies of history that result from the fact that Benedict Arnold was a paradox. He was a villain, he was a hero. He promoted the revolution, he tried to destroy the revolution. And because that's a kind of a hard concept to get your mind around, people from the beginning have always tried to paper over the paradox by saying, well, he wasn't a hero at all. And his accomplishments were insignificant, or he didn't participate, or his motives were suspect. But that type of thinking is like history for children. It's Parson Weems' idea that there's just good and bad, and it's got to be one or the other, and George Washington never told a lie. But I think what I would call history for adults, you have to begin to understand the nuances of history and the contradictions and the conflicts, because there's many paradoxical people in our history, Aaron Burr being one of them from the Revolutionary War, Ethan Allen himself, and in later years some people like John Brown. Was he a good person because he tried to free slaves, or was he a bad person because he resorted to violence? Well, it was a paradoxical situation. And these paradoxical people can be dangerous, and Benedict Arnold certainly was dangerous. I'm going to jump ahead to 1776, and now we see the value of Fort Ticonderoga, because the British do start that invasion from Canada. They sent a 7,000-man army with a lot of cannon over to Canada, and they wanted to come down Lake Champlain and take over that water corridor, but they're unable to do so because if they bring the army down in transports, they would be vulnerable to American armed ships that Arnold already had on the lake. So they have to build their own fleet. And they begins a arms race down here at Skeensboro. Benedict Arnold, who is in control of the nautical aspects of the defense of Ticonderoga, is building gunboats and small sailing boats with cannon. And up there in St. John, the British are doing the same thing, only with much more resources and a much bigger fleet of warships in order to come down and conquer the lake and continue down with their invasion. But that arms race went on all summer, and eventually Benedict Arnold took his small fleet and went up to the very north end of Lake Champlain and waited for the British to come down, figuring it was about to come down, and nothing happened. He waited all through September. The British were continuing to build more and more ships, and they built a frigate that was like an ocean-going frigate on Lake Champlain, and nothing like that had ever been seen on the lake, with plenty of firepower. They wanted to have overwhelming power before they came out on the lake. Benedict Arnold pulled his fleet back to Valcour Island, which you can see a little bit down the lake. And there's a bay between Valcour Island, which is about a mile off the New York shore. He put the fleet in there to protect it from the storms that were coming down more and more in the autumn, and to be sort of hidden from the British. And it wasn't until October 11th that the British finally ventured out onto Lake Champlain with a much bigger fleet than the Americans thought that they had. So as they were sailing down, Arnold's second in command said, we got to get out of here. This is suicidal to stay in this bay and wait for the British. And Arnold said, no, I have a plan. And he always had a plan. He had quite an uncanny feel for tactics and strategy. And he said, we're going to fight the Royal Navy, and we're going to beat them. And he was so enthusiastic about it, he got all his boat captains to sign on, and they met the British. This is a contemporary map. It's not a real accurate map, but it shows sort of the dynamics of the battle. And the Americans were up here, and the British are down here with gunboats that moved up and down. The Arnold's plan was that all of his boats were at anchor, So they didn't have to sail. They weren't very good at sailing because a lot of these guys were from the Army. But they were able to fire cannon from anchor. They fought for 7 hours. Very brutal form of warfare, point blank cannon range, shooting back and forth. It got dark, and the Americans were still standing. The British had never been able to break through the line. But they'd expended 3/4 of their ammunition. A lot of their boats were damaged. Now what? Arnold said, I have a plan. We're going to escape. And the escape from Valcour Island, the Valcour Bay, they couldn't go to the north because there was shallow shoals in the north. And they escaped right through the British blockade of boats heading south. And it was almost like a fairy tale. In the middle of the night, very quietly, they were slipped away. And the British were flabbergasted the next morning, just empty water in front of them. There was more fighting farther down Lake Champlain. Most of the American fleet was destroyed by the time it was over. But the outcome was that by the time the British got their army down to Fort Ticonderoga, it was too late. They felt it was too late in the season, and they were afraid that Lake Champlain would freeze. They would be trapped down there. They went home. They went back up to Canada and figured we'll try it again in the spring. So the campaign in the north in 1776 was a complete success due to Benedict Arnold. Was that an important achievement? Well, all you have to do is look at the other end of that long water corridor of New York City. This is showing a Battle of Brooklyn. George Washington lost the Battle of Brooklyn, the largest battle of the entire war, in August. He was driven out of New York City. He was driven off of Manhattan. He lost in White Plains. He went over to New Jersey. He was chased across New Jersey all the way out down here to Pennsylvania. And his 20,000-man army was reduced to 3,000 men. And he wrote a letter to his brother. He said, I think the game is pretty near up. If he'd had to worry about an invasion coming down the Hudson River, I think it would have been curtains for him. But instead, Benedict Arnold and General Gates, who was in charge of Ticonderoga, brought more than 600 men from Ticonderoga, they're no longer needed there because the British had gone home, down to Kingston, New York by boat, and then marched out across New Jersey and joined Washington's army in Pennsylvania. And some of the men who fought at Valcour Island also crossed the Delaware on Christmas night with George Washington and participated in Washington's most spectacular victory at Trenton the next day. Benedict Arnold was not among them because he had been sent off at another assignment, but it was his doing that these men were there. What do the history books say? Well, I can't say it was just a footnote because this book came out not too long ago, Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty, which I wrote myself. But as I was researching that book, I was surprised at how little had been written about, how little known that whole campaign in the North was, because people didn't want to give Benedict Arnold credit after he'd been proven himself to be a traitor. So we jump ahead to 1777 and some local interest. This is Benedict Arnold's house in New Haven. He had gone to New Haven to take a leave. He'd been in action for ever since 75. And while he was on leave, in April, news arrived that Connecticut had been invaded by the British. And they'd landed down at Campo Beach in Fairfield, and he joined up with General David Wooster, who was the overall commander of militia in Connecticut. The two of them rode down from New Haven along the coast down to Fairfield, and when they got there, they heard that the British had gone inland towards Danbury. Danbury was a major supply depot for the Patriots, supplied not only Connecticut but over into the Army on the Hudson River. Colonel Gold Silliman, who was the head of the Fairfield militia, really couldn't do anything but follow after them and observe, because the British had 1,500 combination of loyalist and crack British troops, and the Patriots were completely outnumbered. So Arnold and Wooster went up as far as Reading, and they decided, and this is a different, little bit different view of it, they decided while the British were burning all the supplies, and they burnt tents and shoes and food. We were talking earlier that some of the men at Valley Forge that winter that were walking barefoot, their shoes might have gone up in flames at Danbury. They spent a whole day there just burning supplies. And the plan was for Benedict Arnold from Reading to cut over to Ridgefield and try to block the retreat of the British. The British had heard that the militia had followed them up on the far trails, and decided to come westward and then go cut down through Ridgefield and Wilton and then back down to the coast. General Wooster took a smaller group of militia and followed along after the British to harass the rear. They were moving pretty slowly. They captured some cattle and draft animals, and they were pretty tired out because they'd been marching the whole way. So the British were slowly marching back towards Ridgefield. So Benedict Arnold cut across the back roads, got to Ridgefield. The Ridgefield militia had only been formed a few days earlier, and so you can imagine these guys are just signed up for the militia, and now they're going to face a battle with crack British troops and a celebrity general at their head. Because Benedict Arnold was very famous by that time, and Arnold tried to and did a pretty good job of organizing them, and they built a barricade across the road that they knew the British were coming down this road right up here, and waited for them. And I try to. This is an artist's conception of sort of what the battle looked like. The British would have been very much stretched out on the road. The roads were pretty narrow, and they had 1,500 men, was made a pretty big, and their supplies, and they made a pretty long line. But I try in these things in my book to give a sense of the reality of the action, and get over the idea that this was like a costume drama. These were men were waiting there, inexperienced, had their musket in their hand, and just waiting to see, knowing that that they were going to be going into battle shortly. Very quiet Sunday morning. They heard crackling of musket way in the distance. That was Wooster attacking the rear of the British column. Then it got quiet again. Then they heard more crackling of musketry and the boom of cannon. And that was General Wooster attacking again. The British had sent a couple of their cannon back to the rear, and Wooster got hit with grape shot in the groin and was fatally wounded. Then they heard the music, the drums pounding. And it's like you can imagine the sort of feeling you get on the 4th of July. The parade is coming. You can hear it in the distance. It's exciting. But to them, it was armed men coming to kill them. and they heard the drums, they heard the band playing. I like to also imagine that farm children along the way coming out to see the spectacle. Never seen anything like this before in their lives, with the colorful uniforms and the glittering bayonets and the shiny cannon, all marching towards Ridgefield. And they fought at the barricade. The British had the disadvantage of being in the open, and they were firing from behind the barricade. They inflicted quite a few casualties, but the British had the numbers, so they started to go around both flanks of the Patriot position, and Benedict Arnold finally had to order a retreat. I think you see him on his horse there, and his horse was shot out from under him, and as he was trying to extricate himself from the stirrups, supposedly, this is the story at least, a British soldier ran over and pointed his bayonet at him and said, "You're my prisoner." And he thought he'd won the lottery, I guess. And Arnold pulled a pistol from his saddle and said, "Not yet," and shot him dead and escaped down the road. And they continued to fight down the road, going south on Main Street. This is the famous cannonball in the Keeler Tavern that landed in the oak corner post. It's now a museum, of course, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. Arnold pulled back down to, there's a bridge here, and the British were due to come across that bridge. This is the Saugatuck River, but there was a ford farther up, and they crossed at the ford. But there was a fair amount of fighting at that on their way back to the beach, and they inflicted more casualties before the British finally got over to Campo Beach and got back on their ships and escaped. So the question now, is that an important event? And I think that supply is important in every war, and in a Revolutionary War probably more than most. There's a sort of a catchphrase. They always say, armchair generals talk about battles, but real generals talk about logistics. And the supply logistics was very important in the Revolutionary War. And this inland raids to capture and damage Patriot supplies pretty much ended after because of the cost to the British of all the casualties that Arnold was able to inflict. John Adams said that Benedict Arnold deserved a gold medal for his success at Ridgefield. They never gave it to him, but at the time they thought it was a big deal. But if you look in the history books, again, it's barely a footnote. A lot of people don't even know about the Battle of Ridgefield because it was Benedict Arnold. Arnold did get a promotion out of it. He got made a major general, but he still wasn't happy with his treatment by Congress. Some junior officers had been promoted over his head, so he decided to resign. And he resigned his commission in the Continental Army. He went to Philadelphia, he turned it into Congress, he said, "I'm done." The same day that he turned in his resignation, the news reached Philadelphia that Ticonderoga had fallen. And General John Burgoyne was coming down with that invasion that they'd always intended to make down that water corridor. Because the American fleet had been destroyed the year before, they were able to bring their army down to Ticonderoga. They took Ticonderoga quite easily. And now they were on the march, 7,000-man army towards Albany. Benedict Arnold forgot all about his resignation and jumped on a horse and rode up to joined General Gates, who was in command in the north, and they decided to meet Burgoyne at what's marked there as Bemis Heights, the high ground along the Hudson River, just a few miles south of the village of Saratoga, which is now called Schuylerville. And there were two battles. They're collectively known as the Battle of Saratoga. And in both battles, Burgoyne tried to sweep around the left side of the American lines, and in both battles, Benedict Arnold was in command of the left division. In the first battle, he stopped Burgoyne cold, inflicted heavy casualties. That was on September 19th. On October 7th, in the second battle, he decisively defeated Burgoyne and then led an attack that broke through the British field fortifications, and he put Burgoyne in a position where he had to do what he said he would never do, which was retreat. Benedict Arnold, which as you can see there on his horse, was severely wounded in that battle, shot in the leg. But General Burgoyne, 10 days later, had to surrender his entire army to General Gates. So was that an important achievement? It's called the turning point of the Revolutionary War. It brought the French in. It did change the whole complexion of the war. Time magazine said that it was the single most important battle fought anywhere in the world in the last 1,000 years. So, sounds pretty important. And what do they say in the history books? Well, they can't say it wasn't important. So there's been many stories based on very little evidence over the years in books of history that diminish Benedict Arnold's role at Saratoga. He was drunk, was one story. He was sulking in his cabin. He had been relieved of his command. He wasn't really involved in the battle. While he must have been on the field because he was wounded, okay, he was riding around like a crazy man on the field. And all these stories were recorded in history. But today, they're pretty much being debunked. And most historians, or at least many historians, agree that Benedict Arnold was the essential man in the essential battle of the Revolutionary War. 3 years later, in 1780, we come to that one thing that everybody knows about Arnold, as he went over to the British. This was an effigy that was dragged through Philadelphia that shows him both two-faced and holding a mask, and the devil behind him is on his way to the gallows. People were shocked when he proved to be a traitor. So the question, of course, is often asked is why? Why did he do it? And again, many reasons have been given over the years. Some historians have said that he did it only for the money. The British paid him a fair amount of money for coming over to their side. Some said that he did it because his wife made him do it. He had married Peggy Shippen, who was a 19-year-old loyalist young lady from Philadelphia. Some said that he didn't like the French alliance. Some said that he didn't go along with independence. He didn't really want them to declare independence. Some said it was just because he was disgruntled over the promotions and his conflict with Congress. My own answer to that question, why he went over the British, is I don't know. I think Benedict Arnold was an enigma, and I think it's, again, one of the complexities of history that you can't figure everything out, and I sometimes wonder if he knew himself really why he did it. But he did it. And because he never did anything by halves, he gained control, or got a command that was in the lower Hudson Valley, of which West Point is pretty much up there at the top, just below the Highlands, was part of his command. And he agreed with the British that he was going to allow them to take over West Point. West Point, of course, was not a military academy then, but was a very important fort protecting the Hudson River. And William Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays about history, but the unfolding of Arnold's plot against West Point is really one of those dramas that history itself creates. It started in Haverstraw, here. Arnold went over there to meet with the head of British intelligence to finalize the plan for the takeover of West Point. This was neutral ground, and that gentleman was Major John Andre. And he and Andre talked about the strategy for taking over the fort. He gave Andre a map of the fort, information about troop deployments. He told him to put these documents in his shoe when he went home. Arnold then went back to his headquarters, which was opposite West Point on the east side of the Hudson River. And Major Andre, after some delays, crossed over at King's Ferry, you see there below Peekskill, and was riding down the east side of the Hudson River. Major Andre was very excited, and he was very nervous. He was excited because he'd pulled off the biggest intelligence coup of the war that was going to make his career. It was make his life, really. And he was nervous because that territory below King's Ferry in Westchester County was no man's land. It was below the American lines, and it was above the British lines, and the British were occupying New York. And there were militiamen from both sides that patrolled that area. So Major Andre's riding down on a horse southward. He got as far as Tarrytown, right there. It's actually on the other side. And sure enough, 3 men jumped out of the bushes and stopped him, pointed muskets at him. Major Andre made the mistake of saying, "I hope you're of our party." And so one of the militiamen, who was not as dumb as he looked, said, "Oh yeah, what party is that?" So now Major Andre had a guess. He said, "The lower party," and that was the British down in New York. And the militiaman said, "We're Americans, get down." And they searched him. It was an artist's conception of, found the documents. He offered them bribes. He was going to give them this gold watch and money, and they wouldn't take the bribes. They took him to their commanding officer, Colonel Jameson. Colonel Jameson, in my opinion, was a little slow on the uptake, because the first thing he did was to send a letter off by courier to his commanding officer, Benedict Arnold, saying, "Something suspicious going on here, boss." But then he started thinking, and he's looking over the documents and said, "Wait a minute, this is Benedict Arnold's handwriting on here." And he couldn't quite figure it out, but he decided just, well, send everything to George Washington, let him worry about it. And that's where the plot twist comes in that Shakespeare might have thought of, because George Washington wasn't in the American camp, which was over on the New Jersey border. He had gone out to Hartford to meet with French officers, was on his way back, and this is now Sunday, and Washington on Monday morning was going to have breakfast at the headquarters of Benedict Arnold with Arnold and his wife, and then he and Arnold were going to go over and inspect West Point. So you have the rather tense situation where there's 2 couriers. This is Arnold's house is down here. Beverly Robinson House was a house he took over. and West Point is up here. George Washington was coming down from the north. Two couriers separately were headed towards Arnold's house because the one had found out that's where he's going to find Washington. Some of Washington's aides even arrived there. They said, General Washington's just up the road. Get ready. He'll be here in a few minutes. At that point, one of the couriers arrived, and he hands a letter to Benedict Arnold. Arnold read the letter. He said to his wife, I gotta go. And he said to everybody else, I'm going to go over to West Point. Tell Washington to wait here. He went down to the boat launch, which is down here, jumped on his horse, rode down to the boat launch, jumped in his boat, and he told his crew, row as fast as you can southward. General George Washington arrived. Arnold wasn't there. Where is he? He was over at West Point. Okay, Washington said, we'll go over there and inspect the fort right now before breakfast. Took his entourage over to West Point. When they arrived, nobody had seen Arnold for 2 days. And they started inspecting the fort. All the fortifications were falling down. There were not enough men to protect the fort. And George Washington later described his own thinking, and he said, my mind misgave me, but I had not the least idea of the real reason. And we all know that feeling. It's like, there's something really wrong here, but I can't put my finger on what it could possibly be. He goes back over to Arnold's headquarters, and he decided to take a nap. Before he lay down in bed, another courier arrives and hands him a letter and the documents. And Washington, it doesn't take him too long, figures out exactly what's going on, and he called in Henry Knox, who was his most trusted subordinate. He said, Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now? And this was not a rhetorical question. At that point, Washington had no idea who was involved in the plot or how far it extended. He did what he could, which was to send Alexander Hamilton riding on horseback down the Hudson River to try to catch up with Arnold. He sent a message over to the army, which is on the other side of the river, to send as many men as they could marching up to protect West Point. And then the real drama began. Benedict Arnold's wife, Peggy Shippen, is now Peggy Arnold. This is her in her fancy hairdo. And by the way, this is a drawing that was made by Major Andre when Peggy was flirting with the British officers when they occupied Philadelphia. She started tearing her clothes off and screaming, and I have to see Washington, they're going to kill my baby, and having essentially a hysterical fit. All the officers gathered around, tried to comfort her, thinking that she was shocked by her husband's treason, and not imagining that she could have been in on the plot all along and was putting on an act to help Arnold escape. And he did escape, and he made it down the river to a British ship, went over to the British, was made a brigadier general in the British Army, fought for about a year against the Americans for the British, including burnt the city of New London, and then went to England and never set foot in America again. Major Andre, who was quite a skillful artist, this is a self-portrait of him waiting for his trial. He had been in civilian clothes when he was taken, which was essentially made him a spy, and he was hanged about 10 days later. And the three men who captured him, the three militiamen, were given silver medals. The first military decorations in American history were awarded to those three men because they had stayed faithful to the cause in the medal had the word fidelity on. A few days after Arnold's treason was revealed, one of his aides said, wouldn't it have been better if the bullet that went through his leg at Saratoga had gone through his heart? And a lot of historians down the years have sort of echoed a version of that sentiment, that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would be remembered as one of our greatest military heroes. And I think from just the accomplishments that I've talked about tonight, you can see the logic of that, and those were only a few of, or some of Benedict Arnold's accomplishments. You can see the logic of that idea, but I don't really think it's true. I think that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would have been forgotten. Just like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox and Daniel Morgan and all the men who did the fighting in the Revolutionary War, who were very famous in the 19th century, but have, by the 21st century, most of the general public have forgotten about them. And I live in the Hudson Valley. We have Greene County, we have Putnam County, we have Sullivan County, we have Montgomery County. But you ask people who are these places named for, and they're not really sure. I grew up in Wayne County, up in upstate New York, and I even went to a school called Wayne Central. We never had a statue of Anthony Wayne. We never had a plaque for him, and we never learned why Mad Anthony Wayne was mad. So I'm hopeful that as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, some more attention can be paid to those who just did the fighting. Because we'll remember Benedict Arnold, but what about all the others, and particularly the men in the ranks that deserve a lot of credit for going through a very difficult war in order to create a country. And if you read the diaries and the letters of those days, you often come across this idea that they thought that they were fighting for the freedom of generations unborn. They use that phrase. And we are those generations, and they were fighting for us. Thank you very much. If anybody would like to sign up, I have a website. You can sign up for to get on my mailing list for a newsletter. It comes out about once a week. And I'll take any questions or comments that you might have. Yeah.
The Battle of Ridgefield, Worcester and Arnold, one led from the rear, and Worcester was incredibly brave. He led from the front, tried to rally his men, and was mortally wounded. Okay, you don't hear much about Worcester except around here in the annals of the American Revolution. At least, I'm not a historian, but he's not up there. And then you had Arnold. Not only had his horse been shot out from underneath him at the barricade, but it also occurred down at the bridge, Saugatuck River Bridge. He had a second horse. I mean, the guy was incredible. But that's not the first time they fought together. The first time they fought together, Worcester and Arnold, was in the Northern Campaign. Can you give us an idea about the Northern Campaign and why? I'm always perplexed why it even happened, and it didn't go so well. And Worcester took a lot of heat on that, and I don't think it was his fault. But the whole thing was a mess, and so it was a gigantic failure.
Yeah,
Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Arnold and Worcester had quite a history before they actually their first encounter was on April 22nd in 1775. But news arrived at New Haven that about the fighting at Lexington and Concord. Arnold was so gung-ho, he said, we're going to leave today, or maybe tomorrow morning. And he had a a militia company in New Haven. He even recruited a few Yale students to join up. And he said, all we need is gunpowder and a few more muskets, and we'll march up there to Boston and help out with the siege of the British in Boston. And the town fathers in New Haven were quite understandably said, well, let's wait and see what the real, what's going on. Let's not just rush into this, some dispute up in Massachusetts. And Arnold, they sent General Wooster out to give Arnold this message, hold your horses. And so Arnold said, he was, and really was quite a hothead. He said, we're going to break into the powder house if you don't give us the keys. And Wooster handed them over the keys, and they took their weapons and marched up there. That was their first encounter. Wooster then became, and was a very high-level officer for a while in the Continental Army, and was sent up to Canada. The Patriots, after they took over Ticonderoga in 1775, which I didn't go into, but they then invaded Canada, hoping to bring that in as the 14th colony. The two columns that went up there, one went up the Lake Champlain, and the other was led by Benedict Arnold over the mountains of Maine. It's like a classic and very, very difficult military expedition. They ran out of food. They almost starved to death. It was very difficult trying to get an army on just a little footpath over the mountains of Maine to attack Quebec. They got there. They finally did attack Quebec under General Richard Montgomery. Montgomery was killed in the attack on December 31st of 1775. Arnold then took over, and Arnold wrote back and he said, I'm not up for this. He had no military training practically whatsoever. He said, I send somebody up here to take over, and eventually they sent up General Wooster. And Wooster, instead of coming up to Quebec, where there was not much going on anywhere, he stayed down in Montreal. It was a little more comfortable down there, and finally did come up to and took over from Arnold at Quebec, and got there almost just in time. And I think he was then replaced by somebody else, and then the British reinforcements arrived, and the Americans had to clear out, and they ran all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga. So that the invasion of Canada, you don't hear too much about it because it was a complete disaster, really. But in a way, it made sense. If they could have taken Canada, it would have deprived the British of that base in Canada, from which they later did launch the invasion. So, and they thought they were doing the French a favor, and the French just wanted to stay out of it. They didn't know which side was going to win. So that was their story. And then it turned out that General Wooster had a lot of disagreement with Congress about his promotion, and eventually quit the Continental Army and went back to being a militia general, and that's where they met up in 1777, and Wooster was killed. And I certainly give him a lot of credit, 66 years old, to be out there on horseback and fighting in a hot battle. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of Benedict Arnold's personality traits developed as he was growing up, with all the insecurity issues, the father issues, growing up with a father that, he had to carry home from the bar. I feel Arnold was a loose cannon, but if he had that guidance, I feel that he would be able to be reined in. So I just want to know, like Montgomery, Schuyler, Morgan, I feel once Saratoga happened and he kind of lost guidance from all three of those people, and then he was put in, no worse candidate could have been put in Philadelphia than him. And once you lost that guidance and you had that time alone to become bitter, I feel like he didn't have any guidance anymore. Once he was wounded at Saratoga, he was kind of left to fend for himself. Do you feel like losing their guidance kind of contributed to?
I'm not sure about that. he was very much his own man and really liked to be on his own. Even even in that march over Maine, he was in his glory there to be in complete charge, and he did quite well on that expedition. I don't think it wasn't from guidance. He was really just totally on his own. But it's true that having very little military experience, he did feel he was over his head, and a lot of times he wanted to have people taking charge because he didn't have the sort of structure of military knowledge that other people had. So I think that was a factor too. But I agree with you about his childhood did shape him considerably. Not his father, who was an alcoholic, and Arnold was really the child of an alcoholic. And his mother was also very important, and she was a Calvinist, quite a religious woman, and always told him, remember, you're going to die, and keep that in your mind all the time. And he wasn't religious, but I think he kept that in his mind. And she knew what she was talking about because several of her children died, which was very common back then, but she'd seen them die. And I think some of his military courage, let's say, came from that Puritan mentality of always be prepared to die. Yeah.
Could you talk about his relations with Congress, which I think would be another source of bitterness on his part?
Yeah, I went into a little bit because the question of promotions, which happened in 1777 and led to his resignation, that was a thorny issue for Congress, because every state wanted their own guys to be the top guys and to be among the top officers. And so who was going to be in the upper ranks of the Continental Army? Was it going to be people who were the most skilled and had the most merit and had done things to prove their military skill? Or was it going to be those who had been in earliest, and that seniority was a very big factor then in the military in general. General Putnam, who was not a great general, but he went so quickly up to after Lexington and Concord that he was one of the earliest generals there and had that seniority for the rest of the war. So Benedict Arnold saw guys with less seniority than him promoted over his head because Congress. The other thing they said, well, we want to encourage the states to fulfill their quotas of troops that they're contributing. So the more troops the state sent, the more officers they would appoint from that state. And Connecticut had two major generals and hadn't produced enough troops apparently to justify another one. So that was one reason they didn't want to give Arnold the promotion, which everybody agreed that he deserved, and George Washington certainly did, and he thought he did. I thought it was interesting that today, in the past few weeks at least, we've been involved in Congress meddling in approval of high military promotions. That's a power that Congress still has to this day. So that's, I think, did lead to a lot of disgruntled feeling on Arnold's part, and eventually he decided to resign. And a lot of the military officers thought that Congress they were too worried about a standing army. They thought the standing army would become a military dictatorship, and they wanted to keep control, particularly John Adams. And John Adams was essentially serving as a Secretary of War at that time, and he didn't want to give any leeway to officers because they did great things. So to him, it was keeping control. Anybody else? Yeah.
He went to England afterwards he escaped. How was he received there? How did he live?
It was sort of a mixed bag. He and Peggy and his wife Peggy went over with him, and they settled there. They had, I think, 4 or 5 more children. He'd had 3 children with his first wife, whose name was also Peggy. And sometimes they were hissed at when they went into the theater, because people didn't like him, A, because he was a traitor, and so even he's on our side, but he was still a traitor, and B, because he had killed a lot of British soldiers in his career. So here's a guy that's now, okay, I'm on your side. He was not real happy. They eventually moved to Canada. They lived for 6 years up in Canada, and then he had gotten back in business and was essentially a trader, and then they moved back to England, and he kept trading in the West Indies, and he always wanted to be in the military, but the British would, except for the original, appointed him as a brigadier general. After that, he never got assigned to any active duty, and he wanted to, but they wouldn't. They didn't think he was the proper person to put in there. And it would have been hard with the British military officers. Didn't really like him. They didn't like the fact that he was even a general. That he was made a general. So that was his. He was not a happy man over there in England, and he died fairly young, so about 60 years old, I think, when he died. Yeah, in the back.
What financial pressures was he in? I understood that in Philadelphia he was trying to live a life that was way above what he really made, and that had a lot to do with his need for money.
Yeah, that's definitely true. He was very successful. The house I showed you that was the house in New Haven. It was the biggest house in New Haven at that time, and he was very successful and quite wealthy in the sense of the 18th century. Wealth wasn't, oh, look at, I've got $10 billion to my name, net worth. It was a complex web of debt and income and money. It was much more fluid than that. They didn't accumulate so much as they were in a position to have a lot of money flowing through. And so he was wealthy. And he fought for all this time. He got wounded. He was sent to Philadelphia unwisely it was one of George Washington's few personnel mistakes. Sent him down to be commander at Philadelphia after the British left Philadelphia, and they wanted somebody to oversee the transition back to a civilian government. And he wanted to get back to his life of wealth and associate with wealthy people, and the Shippens were a wealthy family, and he was courting Peggy Shippen. And so he did need money. He bought a big house for her, but then they couldn't afford to live in it. He had to rent it out because he didn't have enough money coming in. So he did have, he was strained. But if you look at him overall, I mean, at the same time, he was giving out money, for example, to the children of Joseph Warren. Joseph Warren was a radical from Boston. And Warren was killed at Bunker Hill, and his children were left orphans. Benedict Arnold, even after he made the plot with the British, sent money for Warren's children to be educated. So he wasn't like dirt poor by any means. And eventually he got back on his feet, and he could have easily been successful in America as a businessman if he kept at it. But for whatever reason, he went over
A
to
quick follow-up. We covered money. I just wanted to check, is it true that Andre had been involved with his wife before Peggy number 1, before he was?
Yeah.
with his first wife?
No, with
No.
Peggy Shippen.
Oh, Peggy Shippen.
Yeah.
When the British took over Philadelphia in 1777, and they held it there for over through the winter. The Shippens they weren't really staunch loyalists. They were just sort of sitting on the fence, and if the British were in control, well, we're with the British, you know. And so Andre designed these gala balls that they put on with big elaborate costumes. You can see the hairdos. I mean, that's she became very friendly with him. Whether it was a romantic relationship, I don't know. I don't know that there was any evidence one way or the other about that, but they were certainly friends. And part of the correspondence, secret correspondence between Arnold and Andre went through her. And she would write a letter, and then he would write in invisible ink in between the lines. So she was certainly in on it. The British government gave her quite a big stipend after she got in England because of that. She had cooperated with it. But what their relationship was, I don't know. He was just, you know, that. He must have been interested in her because of that drawing, I think, in itself shows quite an interest.
What?
Yeah.
Didn't he get back to the business question, the businessman? I had thought that he had quite a history of shady business dealings and was even court-martialed for some of them.
Oh, well, yeah, that is true. In Philadelphia, the trouble was, things were not real clear during the war as to what was the right thing to do, what was the ethical way of managing things. And he used government wagons for his own purposes. He manipulated things and bought and sold on the market in ways that could have been considered self-dealing. And he was court-martialed and was found to be at fault on some fairly small matters and reprimanded. He didn't like being reprimanded, but Washington said, I have to give you a reprimand. Here it is. You're such a great soldier, and so don't worry about it. But he didn't like that. But other than that, business was a rough trade back then, and particularly before the war, he was definitely a smuggler because everybody was a smuggler. The British were cracking down and trying to tax the colonies, and the only way you could make money was to come in, bring things in by smuggling, and he certainly was involved with that. And I think that really led him to his fervent interest in the revolution. The people on the waterfront felt the British imposition more than people like a farmer in New Jersey. He didn't have anything to do with the British, but they were right up against the British impositions of the colonies. Anybody else? Well, there's refreshments, and again I want to thank the Richfield Historical Society and thank you all for coming out.